Hi. TX-6 packs a lot of polarizing extremes in a very small box. It's an attempt to miniaturize mixer controls and features you'd expect, and some you wouldn't, in as portable and tight as possible a space, and at $1,200 seemingly regardless of cost. It has 6 stereo inputs, another hidden mic input in the headphone jack, and a fader and 3 knobs per track. The knobs are assignable to a broad range of parameters. It has 2 master effects, an auxiliary output for effects routing, and surprisingly, a limited synth and drum machine with basic capabilities. Aside from being a mixer, it's also a multi-channel audio interface and a wireless Bluetooth MIDI controller. In this video, I'll take a detailed look at what it can do and what it can't, how usable it is, including pros and cons compared to the competition. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Teenage Engineering sent TX-6 to me at no cost other than import fees, but they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by people who subscribe to my book updates and extra content on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Let's start with an overview. TX-6 is a few things. It's a 6-channel stereo mixer with a 7th mono mic input in the headphone jack. You can also plug 2 instruments into one input using a splitter like this, 2 mono instruments, in which case they'll have joint control in a single track. It also has a basic 6-track drum and waveform synth. Sound design for these synths is fairly basic, and you can sequence them using a number of preset sequences, about 20 of them. As for the synth tracks, you can tune them chromatically if you cycle through the features here, but you can't play them chromatically using an external keyboard, for example. While TX-6 doesn't have any TRS MIDI inputs or outputs, it can work as a MIDI controller over USB or wirelessly over Bluetooth, with the most knobs, faders, and buttons per square inch I've ever seen on a controller. It has a built-in rechargeable battery, which should last up to 8 hours according to the spec. Each of the 6 tracks has 3 control knobs by default assigned to low, mid, and high EQ, a fader for level. You've got LEDs to monitor levels, and these are multifunction buttons. Right now they're in synth mode, but you can also move them out of synth mode, in which case they'll function as mutes or solos. The knobs can be configured to different destinations in multiple modes with some limitations. We'll talk about that in a bit. TX-6 also has 2 effects slots. Slot 1 is a send effects slot, and it can host one of 3 effects: reverb, chorus, or delay. And slot 2 can host one of 6 insert effects: various distortions, tremolo, freeze, tape. We'll go over these later, and these can be applied as inserts either to all 6 tracks or just one of them. So let's talk about the non-elephant in the room, aside from the price, which is the size. TX-6 is very small. You can see it compared to a pocket operator or to a Volca, or maybe to something you're more likely to have in your pocket, a quarter. You can cover almost 4 knobs with a single quarter, or if you're from Europe, I happen to have a €2 coin from Superbooth, so it's about this big. Now, despite that, the only place where it feels cramped is obviously these knobs, and in particular, if you want to reach the 4 in the middle, when you want to reach for those at the extremes, it's a little bit easier. Always be touching one other knob when you turn a knob, but despite that, it doesn't feel like you trigger any of the others when you move the controls. It just takes a bit of intent to focus on the one you want to change. The knobs don't have center detents. They're smooth knobs, not encoders, smooth pots, but you can find the 0 points when relevant relatively easy. It sort of snaps to it when you're around that center area. The select encoder is an endless encoder and has detents, so it's easier to control things more precisely. And it's not a push encoder. It has this little button on top, which you can press to access parameters. It takes a bit more conviction to press, I think, than the other buttons because it's kind of a little bit wobbly, but it works. The TX-6 also has 2 buttons here on the front side panel to access auxiliary and cue controls. If you need to edit more than one parameter at a time on one of these pages, you just tap the select button and you can do that. And then Shift also exits menus. The overall build seems excellent. It feels like a block of aluminum. Maybe these knobs are a little bit wobbly, but you don't feel like they're going to fall off at any point. There's an on-off switch on the bottom left, which takes a little bit of force. I only hit it accidentally once when I tried to pick it up and turned it off, but overall I wouldn't say that it's a switch that's easy to flick off accidentally. Each track has 5 LEDs that work as level meters and a small OLED screen, which is viewable from any angle, and it has both a dark and light mode or theme. Personally, I find that the dark mode is easier on the eyes, but this is what the light mode looks like. In terms of connectivity, on the back are 6 stereo line level inputs. They're packed quite tight, so you'll need cables with a slim connector if you want to use them all. Teenage Engineering sells some, but I got these off AliExpress and they work pretty nicely. Hopefully I won't cause a dent in space-time if I connect 2 outputs. So these work, but anything that's a bit thicker and you won't be able to fit 2 cables next to each other. As you can see, when you plug in the cable, it asks you if it's a stereo feed, mono, or dual mono split. If you choose this mode, like I mentioned earlier, you'll have a single control for both mono inputs, but you could theoretically mix 12 different mono instruments this way. On the front are 3 connectors, a main audio output, and it comes with this adapter. An auxiliary output, which you can mix separately and send to an external effect like I did in the intro to this video. And then the headphone output is a TRRS style jack, the one with the 3 rings, so you could plug in a microphone if you've got a splitter like this, or a cell phone headphone jack with a microphone, and I'll talk about the mic processing in a bit. The cue output, by the way, is useful if you want to monitor muted tracks or in DJ mode, but the auxiliary and main outputs have a better converter, so use that to record whatever you're playing if you want. Aside from the analog I/O, also on the back is a USB-C jack. This can be used to recharge the internal battery, as well as for multi-track audio, both out and in one of a few modes, which I'll talk about. The USB audio in TX-6 is also made for iPhone compliance, so if you have a cable like this, you can plug USB-C in the back, and then choose the multi-channel USB out mode. And if all goes well, then it should pick up all the channels individually. So you could potentially multi-track even into an iPhone, obviously also into a computer over regular USB-C. Okay, let's take a closer look at audio processing. This is a stereo source, so let's pick that. The default onboard knob controls are EQ. Then you've got obviously level control, and you can access additional track parameters if you haven't reconfigured the knobs to control other things with Shift and holding a track button. There's a low pass to high pass filter. EQ. You can't control, by the way, the EQ when these knobs are active, controlling these parameters. If they're assigned to something else, this is how you change the EQ. Then there's a compressor, which can get pretty harsh. Gain on the input will distort, obviously. This is analog gain, by the way, before the DAC. Panning per channel. You can long press to reset a parameter, and a few synth controls, which we'll talk about later. There are a few other per track controls that you can access differently. One is the effects send. So when you're controlling the effect and you hold a track, you can then edit the send to that effect. So you can control sends individually, and same goes for when you're in auxiliary mode. When you're editing what goes out this auxiliary output, if you press the button, you have per track control over the send through auxiliary to an external effect, or if you want to create a different mix for someone else. Like I mentioned earlier, these knobs or pots can control other parameters besides EQ. If you want to change what these 18 knobs or pots control, go into the menu, into the pots menu, and then move from EQ to one of 3 other modes. Custom lets you assign a different function globally for each of these. So the defaults are filter, auxiliary, and compressor. So now it's a filter, high pass to low pass, and I have direct control over the compressor here. If I wanted to control the EQ, I would now do that. Oops, gotta cycle through these if you miss it. Through this menu. And if you're trying to control a parameter that's controlled by these knobs, say the compressor, it'll sort of blink over here and tell you you need to use the L knob to change that parameter. Anyway, so exit this menu, back into the pots menu. Here we go. So custom, you can change each of these to any one of the track parameters that I discussed earlier. And then another option, if I go back into here, is the per track option. So this is where you can assign the knobs to different parameters on a per track basis. So I could have this knob, say, control the FX1 send for track 1, and then for track 2, I want to control the auxiliary with this knob, or, you know, synth, a synth parameter, or EQ, or anything I wanted basically on a per track basis. And then the fourth option is controlling synth parameters, the frequency, the waveform, and note length. Now there's one important rule you should know about the knobs or pots, which I hope they'll give us an option to change in a future firmware update. Until then, you need to proceed with caution, and that's that the physical knob position always reflects the value of the parameter that it's controlling. Now, theoretically, that's a very good thing. So if you set, say, these knobs to EQ, I know exactly the position of each of the EQs, high, low, and mid for each of the tracks. The problem with this is that if I want to move to a different mode, let's say that I want to edit my synths, then I go to the pots mode and change it to synth mode. Now, all of these pot positions have been loaded into the synth type, frequency, and length, and I've basically entirely changed my kit based on the position of these knobs. Similarly, if I now go into, say, the custom mode, where I control filter, auxiliary, and compressor, if I get into this mode, now filtering has been assigned all of these values, as well as compressor and auxiliary sends. So for example, if I go into the auxiliary button and look at the levels, you can see they're based on whatever these knobs are set to. If I now wanted to, say, fix my compressor levels to whatever I wanted, or the sends to whatever I felt was right, and then again went back into the synth pot control mode, then again, I will have changed the synths completely. And that's because all 18 knob positions are now loaded to control the synths. Anyway, the pots are great, but hopefully they'll add a setting where the knob positions aren't automatically loaded into the parameter values when you change pot modes. I think it should be that only once you touch a pot, then you change the value of the underlying parameter. Until then, what I recommend is that you set the knob mode to whatever suits your workflow and what you're trying to do in a session. Maybe just control the synths or just control EQ and stick to that. Okay, let's move on and talk about the effects. Maybe take a listen to them. FX1 is a send effect. It's got 3 options: reverb with a few presets for the reverb, and then a chorus with a few presets, off and on. Well, this has a built-in chorus, so it may be hard to hear. Then delay. Tempo syncs to whatever this is set to. I didn't sync this to the J6 yet, I'll do that in a bit. And back to the reverb. So those are the send effects. And the insert effects are, you gotta turn them on, they're off now. So now they're on, there's a filter with resonance. brush effect types. Then there are a few distortion options. And then a tempo synced tremolo. Let's maybe take care of that tempo sync now. So you go into the metronome, and you need to do this manually. This is where TRS MIDI sync would have come in handy. You can sync over USB and Bluetooth. I'll talk about that in a bit. Insert effects, unlike sends, are all or nothing, but you can apply them to a single track if you want, as opposed to all the tracks. Then there's a freeze option. You need to hold the button, and you can change its pitch. It would have been nice if you didn't have to hold the button, so you'd get a droning freeze. That would have been super cool. Maybe they can add that in a firmware update. And then tape stop, self-explanatory. And remember, you can apply this to a single track if you want. And yep, those are the insert effects. Nice. To apply the insert effects to one track, you just press that track when you're in the insert effect mode. So say, choose this one or this one. It's only one at a time if you choose one track or all of them. A few other small things for the send effects. If you hit Shift and turn the select encoder, you can choose the return level, the overall level of the effect within the mix, and you can monitor effects before applying them using the Q output. Speaking of which, let's talk about the Q output. So by default, tracks that are muted are, of course, muted. But if I go ahead and plug us into the Q output, you can still hear the Q tracks if you are in Q mode as opposed to main mode. And you select which tracks you want to hear in the Q output by pressing the track buttons in Q mode. And like I mentioned earlier, if you have one of these headphones we used to have before we were forced to buy wireless ones, then there's a, quote, hidden microphone in this output. So I'm going to put these on and I'll be talking through this mic input. But like I mentioned, you can use an adapter like this to plug in any dynamic mic, no condenser mic or phantom power support here. So now if you hit Shift and Q, you can turn the microphone on or off, increase the microphone volume, and then Shift Q again lets you increase the gain of the microphone. And then you've got noise gate controls, which works pretty nicely. You can hear the AC in my room silenced when I don't speak. And then there's the ducking option, which will duck incoming audio. So this is with ducking off, and with ducking on, works pretty nicely to silence audio coming in. There's no level control for the extent of the ducking. The mic also has dedicated effects controls. Reverb, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. And you can choose the extent of the reverb. This is independently, by the way, of the effect that you choose for this slot. And then you also have a delay effect. Okay. Let's talk about the auxiliary output. You can use this to send a different mix to someone else or to use an external effect. For that to work, you need to plug the effect, the input into the effect, into the auxiliary output. And I've got these TRS adapters because this effect has 1/4 inch I/O. And then you want to take the effect output, for which you'll need another adapter, lower levels initially just to make sure there's no feedback, and plug that into any of the inputs you want to use as a return input. And then if we head out to the auxiliary controls, you want to make sure that you don't send audio on that channel, unless you want a feedback loop, but in general, you don't want to send audio back into the effect from the effect itself. And then you can increase the level on the input. And then you could set the individual sends on a per track basis. Let's just increase them all here for a bit. So now we've got all the tracks except track 6 sending audio to the effect. I can turn it on and then fire away. And we now have an external effect connected back in to our mix. Okay, let's move on and talk about the synth, both drum synth and waveform synth in TX-6. This works in one of a few modes. So by default, these buttons will mute or solo tracks based on what you choose in this menu. So mute, solo, and momentary mute or solo. Anyway, back to the synth menu. There are 3 modes for this: play, sequence, and tone. Play will just let you trigger the different drum tracks using these buttons. Sequence mode will get a sequencer going for all 6 tracks. So the way this works, maybe let's just choose one track. So this is the kick. If I go into the track parameters and go to the sequencer option, you've got one of, I think, currently 22 different sequences. As well as a randomize option, which will swap sequences every bar. So you can't create custom sequences with this, but it's a nice way to get things going. And if you need drums in a pinch, then this could work within the context of a small setup, I think. And then the third mode is tone mode. This drones any waveform synths and lets you play them together. So let's talk a bit about the synth options here for the drum and waveform synths. If you enter the menu and page to the first synth page, you'll get your first choice of one of 4 different drum synths. And then for each of these, you've got a frequency parameter and a length parameter. So closed hat, open hat. And then if I cycle back to the synth selection, you also have 4 waveforms: a sine wave, triangle, square, and saw. And when you do that, the frequency knob becomes a chromatic keyboard. So this is how you tune each of the tracks that's set to a waveform. The length parameter, by the way, isn't relevant for play mode. It'll just play for as long as you hold the button. It is relevant for when you sequence the tracks using the sequencer. So that's it in terms of sound design controls for these synths. You can obviously control their EQ, and if you want also the filter, but there's no LFOs, no envelopes. It's just on-off for each of these. There's no attack or decay controls. And once you set a frequency, you know, that's it. You can, like I mentioned earlier, turn on drone mode or tone mode, in which case you can bring the synths in and out, but you can't play them, and you can't play them over MIDI either. You can trigger these over MIDI, by the way. I think it would be nice if they added chromatic control for the synth tones over MIDI as well. Another important question is how you get this to sync up with other gear. So if you can send it to tempo over Bluetooth or USB, you can, but that's a little bit difficult, I think, with the hardware setups that this is designed for. As a workaround for using MIDI, there are a couple things you could do to get in sync with other instruments after you've set the tempo properly. If you hit start stop, obviously, if you get that in sync, then that's one way. And then a second option is to press the number 2 button, and you can use that to restart the sequencers. That's what I did in the intro to this video to get the sequencer in here in sync with my with the rest of the setup. Let's talk about a few other miscellaneous features. I mentioned you can send audio over USB. There are 3 modes for this. Either 2-channel mode, so you can send audio from an iPhone or computer into this and send the entire mix back into an iPhone or computer if you don't want to mess with multiple channels. Then there's 12-in mode, where you can send audio over USB to each of the 6 tracks, and then you get a mix sent back. And then there's 12-out mode, where each of the 6 tracks sends a stereo pair back out to your iPhone or computer. The mic input, by the way, or the effects out doesn't get sent separately or at all. So you only get the raw audio from the 6 tracks. I think it would be nice if they added, if it's possible, another stereo pair for the effects and for the microphone input. USB audio, by the way, has only one sample rate, 48 kilohertz. TX-6 also sends MIDI over USB and Bluetooth, so you can actually use this as a MIDI controller. You go into BLE, turn on Bluetooth. I've tried this with my Mac, and it does discover it well and sends MIDI back and forth nicely. I also tried it with my iPhone using MIDI emitter. Go into the TX-6 here, hook them up, they're connected. And then let's say open the Model D app here. So if I hop into the settings and make sure MIDI is listening to TX-6 Bluetooth, I could go into Map CCs, and you need to go into the MIDI menu and turn on RX and TX. Then go into here, hit Map CCs, and if all goes well, here we go. Choose a button or fader. Turn this, and then maybe move this, and then move this. And we now have control over these knobs with the faders, and we could assign the pots and the track buttons or other buttons as well. One more, a bit of a gimmicky feature, I think, but it's in here, is the DJ mode. So you can take audio going into inputs 5 and 6, and you're going to want to have slimline cables for that because they're close together. I think they should have picked maybe inputs 4 and 6 to get some distance between the two. But luckily I have a few of these laying around the house. So plug that into here and then this into input 5. I'll choose stereo for this too. So once I've got my inputs in here, I could obviously DJ this manually. Just bring in one. And the faders are a bit close for this, but fade them in or out like this. But also go into DJ mode and turn that on, and then you'll only hear one of the two, and then use fader 1 to crossfade between the two. And there are a couple of modes. So that is DJ mode. Let's just go through the menus to make sure I didn't miss anything. Talked about mutes and solos, temporary and not, pot modes, synth modes, MIDI, Bluetooth. There's a tuner in here, DJ mode, memory. This lets you set temporary filtering and EQ controls for these 2 buttons, so you can use them for that. And a limiter is an overall on-off master limiter. Then VU lets you control whether these LEDs are pre or post fader. And you've got a few brightness controls. If you're getting ground noise, this might solve the problem if you're using USB, but it obviously won't charge the device when you're using it. And I think for the most part, that is it. Okay, let's take a look at pros and cons for TX-6. It's pretty clear that Teenage Engineering set a goal of making the most feature-rich portable mixer/interface with the most hands-on controls in the smallest form factor, regardless of cost. On the pros side, there are certainly a lot of features in here. 6 stereo inputs, aux and Q outs, a microphone input, 18 knobs with multiple destinations. It's a USB and Bluetooth MIDI controller. It's battery powered. If money is no object and you need those features in as small a space as possible, TX-6 is a great choice. So those are the pros. Then I have 2 new pros and cons categories that I invented especially for TX-6, and that's non-pros and non-cons. Let me explain. Non-pros is what I call a feature that's in here, but in my opinion shouldn't be a reason you get this in terms of how I would expect this to work. In particular, in this case, that's the synth, sequencer, and DJ mode. Yes, they're fun in a portable pinch, but as far as the sequencer and synth are concerned, without analog and TRS MIDI sync or chromatic control of the synth, you'd probably just be better off getting an external drum machine. Though, like I showed you in the intro, in a pinch you can use them if you don't mind syncing the tempo manually. Now, you could potentially use a USB MIDI host to sync this over MIDI or sync over USB and Bluetooth with a computer, but that setup might get so convoluted you're better off just using an external synth or a DJ app on your phone. And then on the other hand, the non-cons, in my opinion, are the fact that the knobs are packed very tightly, making them hard to reach, and that the inputs are very close to each other, meaning that you need special slim cables if you want to use them all. So I don't think these are cons, despite what it looks, because while neither is ideal, if you have a goal of making a 6-track mixer that's smaller than a pack of cigarettes, I guess that's a legitimate compromise. So if those aren't cons, what are? First, obviously, price. It doesn't matter how cool a Lamborghini is and whether every custom designed rivet in it is a justified cost. There's only so much one can allocate in their budget for a mixer or interface. Now I'll talk about alternatives, but let's assume we passed that hurdle. There are still a few cons you should consider. Probably the thing that I expected most for a device that's meant to be used in the field is that TX-6 would have a multitrack recorder. Now, yes, in its defense, you can hook it up to your phone and multitrack that way, and you'll likely have your phone in the field too, but it is one more thing to worry about in a setup as opposed to just hitting record on a device and running with it. Also, if having an XLR mic input or phantom power is something you need, this doesn't have it. Aside from those, I have a few cons that might be fixed in future firmware updates. First is the issue I discussed earlier about the parameter values changing to reflect physical knob positions when you change pot modes. I think that makes the otherwise amazing pots mode a feature that's unusable because you sort of need to stick to one, otherwise it'll mess things up when you change pot modes. Hopefully they'll find a firmware solution for that. Then for the effects, it would be nice if you could use more than one effect at a time per slot. For example, a reverb on top of a delay. And I think the freeze effect is cool. It would be nice if you could have a permanent hold option so you didn't have to hold the button if you chose the freeze effect. Regarding audio over USB, the mic, audio, and effects tracks aren't currently sent to your computer or phone in multitrack mode. They are in stereo mode. It would be useful, I think, if that was added. And then finally, a major feature that I think is missing here is presets. Aside from what I showed you earlier, which is the temporary memory mode for these two buttons, and that only works, I think, on the EQ and filter, there are so many track and synth parameters here. Saving the entire machine status, I think, is essential, especially if you want to use this as a synth or a sequencer and you've carefully set up, a few drums here and synth levels and frequencies on other tracks. There needs to be a way to save all of that and then recall it. In terms of alternatives, obviously there are many bigger mixers, but if you want a small form factor, things range from anywhere from this MiVolts 5-in, 1-out passive mixer. I think this costs 20 or 30 bucks. Obviously no hands-on controls, but it will mix a setup. Then there's this analog passive mixer, again, very cheap, 4 inputs, single out. Then as you scale up in price, there are quite a few portable recorders like the Zoom H6 with 6 mono inputs, so not 12 stereo inputs, but it does have a few more intricate controls and it can record as well. And I know a lot of people are going to ask to compare it to Blue Box, which I thought was small but looks absolutely huge compared to this. I made a whole review about this, so I won't talk about it at length. When I reviewed it, I complained that it can't act as an audio interface, doesn't have enough hands-on controls, and doesn't have an internal battery. It also doesn't have a compressor per track. The T6 has all those things, but Blue Box can record onto an SD card. You can use the delay and reverb simultaneously. It does have fewer hands-on controls, but it does have a big touchscreen, so it's pretty easy to see what's going on with multiple parameters and control multiple parameters at a time. It also never feels cramped. See a link to my full review below. So that's it for T6. I have a whole audio interface buyer's guide in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Don't forget to ring the YouTube bell if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.